Before we dive into tonight's chilling tales, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Whether it's the dead of night or a quiet afternoon, these stories are guaranteed to send shivers down your spine. So sit back, turn off the lights, and prepare yourself for mystic horror. California has always been my sanctuary for adventure. The vast expanse of wilderness, the towering redwoods, and the golden sunsets over the Pacific hold a special allure. But this time, my love for solo hiking led me to an experience I'll never forget, and one I wish I could. It was early spring when I decided to hike in the remote areas of the Angeles National Forest. I had heard about a trail called Devil's Hollow, a lesser-known path that boasted stunning views and a sense of complete solitude. It sounded perfect. After all, I loved the quiet and the challenge of pushing myself beyond the comfort of crowded trails. I packed lightly but thoroughly. Water, a first aid kit, protein bars, a flashlight, and my old reliable compass. I also brought a journal to jot down thoughts, hoping the solitude would inspire some creativity for my projects. I arrived at the trailhead just before noon. The sky was a pale blue, streaked with wisps of clouds that promised a beautiful but cool day. My car was the only vehicle in the dirt parking lot, and the lack of other hikers gave me a thrill. I was ready to conquer the trail alone. The first few miles were everything I had hoped for. The trail was narrow but well-defined, winding through dense clusters of oaks and sycamores. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional rustle in the underbrush hinted at squirrels or rabbits scurrying about. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and wild flowers. I was about 3 miles in when I noticed the first oddity, a tree with strange carvings on its bark. The symbols looked ancient, almost like runes, and they encircled the trunk in uneven spirals. I paused, brushing my fingers over the etchings. They were too intricate to be random scratches, and too deep to have been made recently. I took a picture with my phone, noting the eerie beauty of the markings, then shrugged it off as someone's artistic expression. The trail grew steeper as I climbed higher into the forest. The trees thickened, their gnarled branches forming a canopy that dimmed the sunlight. Hours passed and I lost track of time, immersed in the rhythm of my footsteps and the distant hum of nature. Around 4 p.m., I came to a fork in the trail. One path continued upward, while the other veered sharply to the right, descending into a darker part of the woods. There was no sign indicating which way to go, and my map didn't show any forks in the trail. I hesitated. Logic told me to stick to the upward path. It seemed more traveled and safer, but curiosity pulled me toward the shadowed descent. I thought about turning back, but the thrill of the unknown won. I stepped onto the darker trail, convincing myself it would loop back to the main one. The air grew colder the farther I went. The birdsong faded, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on me like a heavy blanket. The trees seemed alive, their twisted forms leaning in as if to watch me pass. After about half an hour, I realized I hadn't seen a single marker or sign of other hikers. My unease grew, but I pushed on, telling myself I was overthinking. That's when I saw it, a cabin nestled in a small clearing. The structure was old and decrepit, with a sagging roof and windows covered in grime. It looked abandoned, but there was something unsettling about its presence. I debated whether to approach it, but my curiosity got the better of me. As I stepped closer, I saw the same carvings from the tree earlier, etched into the cabin's wooden walls. They were more extensive here, covering nearly every surface. My stomach churned as I noticed fresh scratch marks on the doorframe, as if something, or someone, had clawed at it recently. A cold breeze swept through the clearing, carrying a faint whisper. I froze, straining to hear, but it was gone as quickly as it came. My instincts screamed at me to leave, and I obeyed, backing away and returning to the trail. By the time I realized I was lost, the sun had dipped below the horizon. Shadows stretched long and dark, swallowing the trail. My flashlight flickered as I clicked it on, casting a dim beam that barely penetrated the encroaching darkness. I tried to retrace my steps, but the trail seemed different, twisting and looping in ways that didn't make sense. Trees I thought I had passed earlier now loomed ahead, their carved runes glowing faintly in the beam of my flashlight. Panic set in. I pulled out my compass, but the needle spun aimlessly. My phone, which had been fully charged, now refused to turn on. It felt as though the forest itself was conspiring against me. As I stumbled through the woods, I began to hear things. Soft footsteps that weren't mine, whispers that seemed to come from the trees, and the occasional low growl that sent chills down my spine. Then I saw them, glowing eyes in the darkness, watching me from the shadows. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, and their eerie amber glow was unlike anything I'd ever seen. My breath hitched and I froze, praying the eyes would vanish. Instead, they moved closer. I turned and ran, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. Branches scratched at my arms and face as I pushed through the dense undergrowth, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was following me. After what felt like hours of running, I burst into a clearing and stopped dead in my tracks. I was back at the cabin. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the carvings on the walls now glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I realized they were coming from inside the cabin. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stepped closer, peering through a cracked window. The interior was dark, but I could make out a single figure standing in the center of the room. It was tall and gaunt, its skin stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes glowed amber just like the ones in the woods. The figure turned slowly, as if sensing my presence. I stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. When I looked up, the figure was gone. I didn't stop running until I saw the faint glow of the parking lot lights in the distance. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they would burst. But I didn't care. All I wanted was to get out of those cursed woods. When I reached my car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I started the engine and peeled out of the lot, not daring to look back. It's been weeks since that hike, but I can't shake the feeling that something followed me home. I've started noticing strange carvings on the trees near my house, and I wake up at night to the sound of whispers. My compass and phone, which I thought were broken, work perfectly now, but I haven't dared to check the pictures I took. California's wilderness may be beautiful, but it hides secrets, dark, ancient secrets that are best left undisturbed. And if you ever find yourself alone on a trail with no one around to hear you scream, remember, some paths are meant to stay unexplored. Hiking alone has always been my way of reconnecting with myself and nature. The solitude, the challenge, the quiet. It's all cathartic. But one hike in California's Redwood National and State Parks changed everything. It wasn't just a bad experience. It was an encounter that still haunts me. It was a spur-of-the-moment trip. I had been working non-stop for weeks, and the thought of escaping into nature for a day seemed perfect. I packed a light bag, water, snacks, a flashlight, my phone, and a small knife. I chose a less-traveled trail known as the Hollow Ridge Path. It was mentioned in an old hiking forum as a hidden gem. Not officially listed on park maps, it promised solitude and views unlike any other. I arrived at the trailhead mid-morning. The day was overcast, the air damp with the scent of moss and rain-soaked earth. A light mist hung in the air, giving the towering redwoods an ethereal quality. The entrance to Hollow Ridge Path was marked by a weathered wooden sign with faded letters barely legible. It read, "Proceed at your own risk." I chuckled to myself, thinking it was a joke or a relic of some old local lore. The trail was narrow and overgrown, winding through dense clusters of ferns and moss-covered logs. The towering redwoods blocked most of the light, creating a perpetual twilight. It was exactly what I wanted, secluded and serene. As I walked, the forest's stillness began to settle into me. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the damp earth and the occasional rustle of leaves. I felt like the only person in the world. About an hour in, I noticed something strange. The trail became increasingly uneven, as if it hadn't been walked in years. There were no footprints, no signs of other hikers. Yet every so often I saw small wooden markers tied to trees with bits of frayed rope. Each marker had a symbol carved into it, circles, triangles, or crude shapes resembling eyes. I paused to examine one closely. The carving was shallow, as if done hastily, and the wood smelled faintly of something metallic. I took a picture with my phone, thinking I'd research it later, and continued. Around midday, I reached a clearing. The mist had thickened, rolling in waves across the ground. In the center of the clearing stood a stone monument, no taller than my waist. It was covered in moss and vines, but I could make out faint engravings on its surface. Curiosity got the better of me. I crouched down, brushing away the moss to reveal strange symbols, similar to the ones on the tree markers, but more intricate. They seemed to form a pattern, spiraling inward toward a central figure, a crude humanoid shape with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. As I studied the stone, the forest grew eerily silent. No birds, no wind, just a suffocating quiet. Then faintly, I heard it, a low hum, like a distant chant. I stood up quickly, heart pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and muffled in the mist. No response. I decided to move on, hoping to shake off the unease. But as I walked, the humming seemed to follow me, growing louder and more rhythmic. It wasn't coming from one direction. It was everywhere, surrounding me. I stopped and turned in a slow circle. The forest looked the same, towering redwoods, thick mist, and the faint outline of the trail. But something felt wrong. The trees seemed closer together, their bark darker, almost black. Then I saw it, a figure, just at the edge of my vision. It was tall and thin, with a pale, almost translucent complexion. It stood motionless between two trees, watching me. "Hey!" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move. I blinked, and it was gone. I tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light or my imagination. But deep down, I knew better. I decided it was time to turn back. The thrill of solitude had given way to a gnawing fear. I retraced my steps, but the trail didn't look the same. The markers were gone, replaced by gnarled branches that reached out like twisted fingers. Panic set in as I realized I couldn't find the clearing or the stone monument. The forest seemed to shift around me, paths appearing and disappearing as if mocking my attempts to escape. My phone, which had full battery earlier, now refused to turn on. The compass app I had downloaded for emergencies spun wildly, useless. Then I heard it again. The hum, louder now, joined by whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves. Desperation drove me forward, and after what felt like hours, I stumbled upon a small cabin. It was old and decrepit, with a sagging roof and boarded-up windows. A thick layer of moss covered the walls, and the air around it felt heavy, almost electric. Against my better judgment, I approached. The door was slightly ajar, creaking softly in the breeze. Inside it was dark, but I could make out a table covered in papers and a single chair. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. The papers on the table were yellowed with age, covered in handwritten notes, and more of the strange symbols. One page caught my eye, a map. It showed the forest with a single path leading to a circle labeled the Hollow. Before I could examine it further, the whispers grew deafening. They seemed to come from inside the cabin, circling me. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with my flashlight, its beam flickering as I scanned the room. The air grew colder, and a shadow moved across the wall, though there was no one else there. Then I saw it, a figure standing in the corner. It was the same pale, elongated form I had seen earlier. Its hollow eyes stared at me, unblinking. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice barely audible over the whispers. The figure tilted its head, as if studying me, and then it stepped closer. Its movements were unnatural, almost jerky, like a puppet on invisible strings. I backed away, my hand searching for the door handle. When my fingers found it, I yanked it open and bolted into the forest. The sun had long since set, and the forest was pitch black. My flashlight barely illuminated the ground in front of me as I ran, branches scratching at my arms and face. The whispers followed, growing louder and more frantic. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes watching my every step. I tripped over a root, falling hard onto the damp earth. As I scrambled to my feet, I realized the ground beneath me was covered in more of the strange symbols carved deep into the dirt. The hum returned, vibrating through the ground and into my bones. I looked up to see the figure standing a few feet away, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Summoning every ounce of strength, I ran. I didn't care which direction. I just needed to get away. The whispers seemed to mock me, the forest twisting and shifting to keep me trapped. Finally, I saw a faint light in the distance, the trailhead. I burst into the open, gasping for air as I reached my car. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, the forest a distant shadow in my rearview mirror. I've avoided hiking alone ever since. The trail I took, Hollow Ridge Path, doesn't appear on any maps, and no one I've spoken to has heard of it. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the hum again, faint but unmistakable. And when I close my eyes, I see those hollow eyes staring back at me. California's forests are beautiful, but they hold secrets, Some paths are meant to be forgotten, left to the shadows and the things that dwell within them. I've always found comfort in nature, especially hiking alone. It's my way of escaping the noise of life and finding clarity. But sometimes, clarity can reveal truths better left obscured, truths about the world and yourself. What happened to me in California's Big Sur wilderness was one of those moments. It was a Saturday morning when I set out for the Pine Ridge Trail in Big Sur. Known for its breathtaking views of the Pacific Ocean and dense forests, the trail was one I had been planning to explore for months. I packed my usual essentials: water, snacks, a flashlight, a map, my phone, and a small survival kit. I also brought a notebook and pen. Sometimes I like to jot down thoughts or ideas inspired by nature. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful but beautiful. The winding roads, flanked by towering redwoods, and the occasional glimpse of the ocean, were a prelude to the adventure ahead. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived. A park ranger was just locking up his office, and he nodded in my direction as I prepared to start the hike. "Be careful," he said casually. "The fog's been acting strange lately." I didn't think much of it at the time. Fog was common in Big Sur, rolling in from the ocean like a living thing. The first few miles were as stunning as I had imagined. The trail wound through lush forests, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above. Birds chirped, and the distant sound of a creek added to the serene atmosphere. I reached a viewpoint around noon. From there, I could see the vast expanse of the Pacific, its waters glimmering under the midday sun. I sat for a while, eating a snack and writing a few notes in my journal. As I prepared to continue, I noticed a secondary trail branching off to the right. It wasn't marked on my map, but a small wooden sign nailed to a tree read, "Don't wander." I chuckled, thinking it was probably a warning to stay on the main path. But something about the secondary trail intrigued me. It looked older, less traveled, and the overgrown vegetation suggested it hadn't been maintained in years. Without fully understanding why, I decided to follow it. The secondary trail was narrower and steeper, cutting deeper into the forest. The air grew cooler, and the trees seemed taller, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes. Then the fog came. It was subtle at first, a light mist weaving through the trees, but within minutes it thickened, wrapping around me like a living thing. The sunlight vanished, replaced by a gray, oppressive gloom. I kept walking, using my flashlight to illuminate the trail ahead. The beam cut through the fog, but seemed to dissolve into it, as if the mist were swallowing the light. That's when I noticed the silence. The birds had stopped chirping, and even the rustling of leaves was gone. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. After about 20 minutes of walking through the fog, I started to hear them. Faint whispers, too soft to make out the words. They seemed to come from all around me, echoing through the trees. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The whispers stopped. I stood there for a moment, straining to listen. Then they started again, louder this time. It sounded like multiple people talking at once, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. I couldn't understand what they were saying, but there was a sense of urgency in their tone, as if they were warning me. My heartbeat quickened, but I tried to stay calm. It had to be the fog playing tricks on my mind, amplifying distant sounds and distorting them. The trail led me to a clearing surrounded by massive redwoods. In the center of the clearing was an old stone well, its surface covered in moss. I approached cautiously, peering over the edge. The well was dry, its interior lined with crumbling stones. But what caught my attention was the smell, an earthy metallic scent that reminded me of blood. As I leaned closer, I noticed something carved into the stones, a series of symbols similar to runes. They formed a spiral pattern, leading down into the darkness. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, and for the first time, I could make out a word. "Leave." The voice was low and guttural, almost inhuman. I stumbled back from the well, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I turned to leave the clearing, but the trail had vanished. The fog was so thick now that I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. Panic set in as I tried to find my way back. Every direction looked the same, trees and fog stretching endlessly. Then I saw them. Dark shapes moved within the mist, their forms indistinct but undeniably human. They glided silently, their movements slow and deliberate. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The shapes stopped, and for a moment, the fog seemed to hold its breath. Then one of them moved closer. It was tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its face was obscured by the fog, but its eyes, dark and unblinking, pierced through the gloom. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root. The figure tilted its head as if studying me, then reached out with an impossibly long arm. I didn't wait to see what it wanted. I turned and ran. No matter how far I ran, the forest didn't change. The fog followed me, thick and unrelenting, and the whispers never stopped. Occasionally, I would see glimpses of the dark shapes, always just at the edge of my vision. They seemed to be guiding me, herding me deeper into the woods. My legs burned, and my lungs felt like they were on fire, but I couldn't stop. The primal instinct to survive pushed me forward. Eventually, I came to another clearing. In the center stood a massive redwood, its bark smooth and polished like glass. As I approached, I realized the tree's surface reflected the foggy surroundings like a mirror. When I looked closer, I saw something horrifying. My reflection wasn't my own. The figure in the tree looked like me, but its face was twisted into a grotesque smile. Its eyes were black pits, and its hands pressed against the surface as if trying to break through. I stumbled back, the whispers now a deafening roar. The tree began to tremble, its polished surface rippling like water. I don't know how I made it out of that forest. The last thing I remember is running blindly through the fog, the whispers and dark shapes closing in around me. When I finally emerged onto the main trail, the fog was gone. The sun was shining and the forest looked normal again. I ran all the way back to the parking lot, where my car was the only one left. I didn't stop until I was miles away, safe within the walls of my home. It's been weeks since that hike, but the memories haunt me. I can't shake the feeling that the forest didn't let me go. It released me. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear whispers, faint but unmistakable. And when I look in the mirror, I swear the reflection lingers a moment too long. If you ever find yourself in Big Sur, stay on the marked trails. The wilderness is beautiful, but it doesn't belong to us. And sometimes it takes more than it gives.